In this video, we'll be taking a look at how to use the Realtime PBR approximated shader, where to get it, how to use it, a brief look into how it works, and also some other PBR options that you might find useful. So why is everyone talking about PBR? Or physically based, that's better, physically based rendering, and more specifically, real-time physically based rendering. Have a look around online at the results, and there's lots of good reasons to hop onto that sort of setup, since if you export out to a game engine like Unreal Engine 4, which is also free like Blender, then you can get some really nice results without having to wait an age on render times. So here's the problem. We're currently waiting on the as yet unreleased Blender 2.8 viewport stuff to really get good real-time PBR results in official Blender. A quick note about that, while at last year's Blender conference, I was able to sit down with Blender founder Ton during the conversation. He blew my mind with the info that they had the go-ahead from Epic to port across the Unreal Engine 4 code that drives its real-time materials. And I believe that's still the plan, so in the meantime, I've put together this, and you might recognize some of these Blender real-time PBR tests from our Facebook page. I think I've managed to do a fairly reasonable approximation that I'd like to show you, since I've been having fun scratching my own game design itch with Blender and Unreal Engine 4. And I really wanted to be able to get the objects using the same sort of textures in Blender and look similar to how things look in Unreal. In order for this blend file to work, you're going to need at least Blender version 2.78. If that isn't out as you watch this, then grab an official daily build of Blender, which will give you the most up-to-date version that you'll need. You'll find all download links somewhere around where you're watching this video, like in the description or on the main page, and once you have what you need, then open it up. So let's have an overview of what we've got in our blend file here. You can see these two objects. This one is the sphere, and this one here is the cube test. And we've just got one more thing in the scene, which is the sun. And that's just giving us the real-time lighting in the scene. This is our main directional light. So if I double tap R to go into trackball rotation, you can see it having an effect there. These two objects, I should say, are on the geometry layer, and this light's layer, unsurprisingly, is just controlling the visibility of our lights in the scene. That way we don't need to fish around in the outliner to kind of toggle visibility and rendering and stuff. So let's select the sphere object and take a look in the node window. We're using nodes down here, as you can see, and this is where all the magic happens. On the left hand side, this is mostly placeholder stuff for now, where textures would be and so on, but the real meat and potatoes is all going on in this group node that we have here. We have inputs for base color, input for metallic, input for specular, but really you wouldn't really input anything into that, just leave it at 0.5. We have an input to roughness. I'll go over this in a little bit more detail later, but these two need to have exactly the same roughness values. So we've just essentially created these sockets just to split the values off there, make it easy. So we're just going to plug roughness into here, and then normals go into here. Now that's the difference between these two guys, is they've got two different materials. It's basically still using the same group, the same sort of basic idea is happening. It's just showing a different setup. So for example, this one isn't using UVs, and so you're going to need to use the geometry node to dictate normals. And this one is using UVs, and it is using a normal map. So instead of using that geometry output there, we want to come over to our textures side and just plug the texture in there and just come out of the normal map node. This output node that we have coming out of the main group is essentially the main output, if you like. That is what we're seeing on this in the viewport. So we have these other outputs though, which just means we can switch what we're going to get to see in the viewport. So if we just want to take a look at what's happening in the environment, we can just click on this output, and there you go. We can also just come over to the texture side of things, and if we just click on this output, you get to see there's the normal map that we're using. And if we had a roughness map being used, or we were creating a roughness map from the base color, for example, we would see it here. And we can also see the base color there. We don't have anything in the base color there, so it's just black. But this thing over here, so long as it's the last output that we select is the one that we're going to see in the viewport. So these outputs are pretty cool for previewing or soloing the separate textures that you're using. And by the way, we can toggle these with the H key. This is the only one that's uncollapsed at the moment. And also note that it has this alpha value. So if I just press A to deselect that cube for a second in the viewport there, so it doesn't have that orange highlighting, and just reduce the alpha value there, you can see it becoming more and more transparent. And we could just set that as a value or whatever, or obviously just plug in some sort of grayscale texture map there to control that. So let's take a look at this environment wrapper. This is what's generating our environment reflections. If we tab into this group, you can see we've basically just got two environments at the moment to choose from. We've got the environment for the Epic Court Day, and that's the Unreal Engine 4's standard HDRI that you can use in Unreal Engine 4. And we've also got this rooftop night. This is from HDRI Haven. Many thanks to Greg Saal for allowing us to include this here. And if we just want to swap the environments in the scene across the scene, we do it within this environment wrapper. So if we just select this one to go into the group output instead, you can see not only does it update on the cube, it updates on the sphere as well. And we can switch that back like that as well. And you can see them both pop back to the courtyard environment. So if we tab back here, we could use this environment wrapper to do that, or we could go Shift A and add a group, and we can see that our environments here, Epic Court Day. And if we just add them in here, instead of going through this environment, we just hook this up instead and plug the output of that into this. So I'll just delete that for now though with the X key. Now let's change gears a little and set a fresh scene up to use this real-time PBR stuff. Model-wise, I'll be using a small part of the bot in Unreal Engine's Showdown VR project, which I've exported from Unreal with a couple of textures to help show this. First step I'm going to do here is to append in the real-time shader. So I'm going to go File and Append, find the blend file, which is here in my case, dig down into it, find the materials, and then click on PBR Sphere Matte. And click Append. Now, first of all, I've just got the model in here for now. What we actually need is the two textures that go with it. So with this material selected, I'm just going to go over to the Textures tab and just use this as a bit of scratch pad to create a couple of textures. So click New and then New again on another slot. This one could be bot_D. I'm just double clicking in the names there to just rename to bot_N in that case. Come down to the image section, click Open, find wherever you have the textures, or in my case I have these textures here, _D for that one, click down to the bot N, image open, same area, _N, open that image. Now we actually don't need these on this material at all. I can actually just completely unhook them there, and then split the view down, left click and drag down there. Have this bottom window as a node editor, and then switch the material that we're using on this object to be the PBR Sphere Matte. And then there we go. Now though, we've got access in here to the textures that we created. So they're looking a little bit small there. Let's just zoom in a bit. So we've got bot_D, and we have down here the normals. We have bot_N. So we've loaded those in. Now we just need to hook them up, but we're not going to see anything at the moment because we're not in textured view. So we can just switch to textured view or Alt-Z or material view even. I'm actually just like setting stuff up in here though. So I'm going to switch to GLSL mode, backface culling, ambient occlusion, display only render probably. No, in fact, before we do only render, I'm just going to switch this to be a sun lamp, so that we have a stronger light source there without any fall off really. So anyway, select this again, only render, and then the world background. Now the world background is very grey at the moment, but we want this kind of what we're seeing in the reflections to be kind of our world. I'm just also going to press Control Space just to hide that gizmo there. So for that we need to come over to our Textures tab and find our World tab within Textures, and then we've already got it in the scene. We can find this Epic Day on 01 sharp. And once we do that, we can find at the bottom here under Influence, we want to influence the horizon, and now we get that showing up. Or we can turn that off by unchecking the world background. So let's take another look at this now that we have it. I'm just going to put the world background back on though. Now the texture may be in here, but we've not actually got it hooked up. It's still just this green color that we're using. So if I just drag out from the color socket into base color, that should hook up the diffuse that we've got. Also, this isn't really a metallic object right now. It's set to 0, so it's looking more like plastic. So I'm just going to drag that all the way up to 1. Just to say that the whole thing is completely metallic, ignoring rust and stuff like that. And then we can take out from the normal map. This is going to go and plug in instead of the geometry, and plug in just right there. And that is most of the way there. The only issue at the moment is if you're going to take a texture, a normal map from Unreal, the way Unreal handles normal maps, the Y channel or the green channel, depending on how you look at it, will need to be flipped. So that's very straightforward. I've actually added this little group node here, which means you can just mute this or not, and just you can see the sort of normals just kind of flipped, and that is now correct for what we need for this model. The final thing we can do is just to introduce a little bit of environment lighting in here. In fact, this is much more reflective when it's metallic. So let's actually just switch that back to being kind of like plastic. You can see what I mean now on the dark side. It's extremely dark. We don't really want that to be like that. So what we can do is come over to the World tab, enable our environment lighting, and then instead of it being a full white color, we're going to use the sky colors. And then from this, we're going to sample it. We're going to click on the horizon color, click on the little sampler eyedropper, and then click somewhere down the ground there, and then take a look up at the sky, take a look at the zenith color, eyedropper again, and then just drop it in. That should be okay for the most part, but what I like to do is just take these brightness sliders and just crank them all the way up to something like that, and then kind of control the brightness of them just with this energy setting, so something like 0.2 say. So we're almost there apart from the roughness. Let's do something which is quite typical and generate our roughness from the base color texture. So you'll see over here we have the base color texture that's being wrapped around from the color output back over to here. What's happening here is you could just choose to split the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, or just mute this just to use all channels at once. It's just completely up to the specific case at the time. But let's just click on this output of the roughness so we can see what's happening. So this is our roughness map at the moment. And basically this is coming through this color ramp node, which is essentially just there to flip, but also gives us a little bit of opportunity to change contrast if we wanted to. Then we have this subtract node, which is just kind of like an offset. So if we just take that down, we can kind of make everything a little bit, well, in this case, the closer it is to white, the more rough it's getting. So I'm going to take this the other way, so it's a little bit smoother, like this. And then here we're going into a color mix node, and we can essentially clamp the low and high values of our roughness. But I'm just going to leave it like that, I think. And then also, instead of just this single value feeding into the roughness, we're actually going to swap it out of here and then just replace that by hooking that in there. And now if we take a look at clicking on our main output again, you can see the kind of thing that we're getting. So let's also, just for maybe a little bit of added realism, we'll take this back up to being completely metallic, and we can see what's happening there. And if we now play with the settings a little bit more, you can fine tune how you want it to appear. So we can see if we step this up, everything is becoming a little bit more smooth and shiny. And if we just take it this way, we can maybe get it into somewhere nice and in between those two. So with that, I think we're ready to take a look at the big picture there. You can see all the maps are coming in. And now I think we should just take a little look at what's going on behind the scenes here. Probably one of the key aspects of what's going on are the reflections. So let's dig into this node here. So I'm going to click on the output so you can see it. And so that it's a uniform roughness throughout, I'm just going to swap from the texture to plug this single value back in so it's completely shiny again. If we take a look at this, you can see at the top, if we look down on the model, it's reflecting the sky. If we look underneath, it's reflecting the ground, and then if we look around, it sort of looks like that's how we would expect it to reflect in real life. And that is thanks to, if we tab into this group and then again the environment and then go shift space to go full screen, that is very much thanks to the Blender for Web guys who created this node. So it takes the normal map vector and it takes the geometries, it takes the view vector, and it blends these together in this piece of wizardry. And basically, somehow, this creates, the realistic reflections. So anyway, many thanks to those guys. that is feeding into all of these texture nodes. So this is completely sharp at the top. Then this is a roughness of 0.05, and then the environment map was baked out again, and then baked out again at 0.1 and 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, and then finally at 1. To know which one to actually display is handled by this group node. We could dig into this one by pressing tab, and you'll see that this sort of maths is much more my speed, much more simple stuff. So the roughness value is coming in at the bottom, it comes up here, and then it plugs into this thing. And this is trying to take this color mix node and have it so that it shows the completely sharp texture in the first socket, so it's 0. And then at 0.05, we want it to, this value coming out of the coming into the factor needs to be 1, so that it shows what's going on in the second socket. So 0.05 multiplied by 20 gives us 1, and so that's why this multiply node is there. If we go up 1, we need to do something slightly different for all the others, which is just simply subtract that 0.05. So we're going back from 0.05 back to, so when we type in 0.05, I should say, it subtracts that, so it again shows you just whatever happens to be in the first socket. When it goes to 0.1, 0.1 times 10, which is 1. So it's then going to show us that. And then basically you can step through, and I won't bore you to tears with just stepping through everything, but it's essentially the same kind of idea until you get to the end where it's going to give us this. And then that gives us the group output. And then that gives us the group output again. And then if we step back again by the tab key, you see that's what's plugging into the environment map. So without labouring too heavily over the simple maths behind it, I'm sure you'll be able to dig through it, or at least throw a comment our way if you need more on that part. So next we need to take a look at the main shader group. So if we tab into here, I've tried to label what everything is doing for the most part, but as an overview we have these 3 materials. This one here handles the non-metallic diffuse colours pretty much, and this one is the reflections, and this one here is a special case material for very, very rough metals. So that seemed to need a different diffuse shading type. So if we go shift space to take a look at the properties window over here under the materials tab, you can see that this one is actually, the one at the bottom here is using this Oronea diffuse shading type, whereas these two are using Lambert, as you can see over here. So the next thing to take a quick look at will be this real-time highlights group, since it's quite similar to the other one that we just took a look at. In fact, if we tab into it, go shift space, you can see it actually still uses that same roughness calculations group node that we were looking at before. Just inside here, it's just the same thing as before. The difference is, instead of using a stack of a load of textures, we're just using a few materials instead. That change, if we again shift space, you can take a look at this one. You see the hardness is 511 on that one, hardness on this one is 40, next one down the hardness is lower again, 20. In fact, it's a slightly different type of shading to get that. And then just to get more versions out of it, I'm just kind of crunching down those highlights and the spread and how large they are using these RGB curves. As the reflections get wider, we want the highlights to kind of get dimmer a little bit. As the same amount of light gets spread across, it becomes dimmer. And that's what these sort of nodes are doing. And then we get our group output. So just to demonstrate that a little bit more, I've got this black sphere over here with this material on it, and we can see our speculars at full intensity and full hardness. We've got one lamp in the scene, which is creating this highlight that we can see on there. And then if we just drop down the hardness, you'll see that this highlight will spread out. And as it spreads out, to get something a little bit more physically accurate, we want to be able to reduce the intensity, which we can do here with this slider, or we could just drop it further into black. So that's basically what we're doing with these materials. We're taking the hardness value and dropping it down to spread out the highlight, but we're also mixing in black to reduce the intensity of it, and using these RGB curves to just tweak exactly how fast that intensity drops. Now, I realize I could go in further and really drill this home and as to what exactly everything is doing and why, and give lots of examples and so on, but I don't really want to get too deep into analyzing all this here for reasons I'm hoping will become clear in the next section. So let's talk about some limitations and potential improvements, and the big one is Fresnel. So Fresnel doesn't seem to really be officially supported within Blender Internal. there is ways to get more reflectivity at glancing angles by sort of hacking something together with the geometry node and then taking the normal output. But this is not really Fresnel, and you'll see what I mean, because if we switch over to Cycles Render, we can go Shift A to input a Fresnel node, and then we can actually switch back to Blender Render, hook that up to the output, and we do actually get to see a proper Fresnel on this object. In fact, if we plug in the normal output into the normal input of the Fresnel, it's kind of even better. Except it is incorrect, so we shouldn't be getting this highlighting here. So what we can do is we can come over to this new button under the Render tab, under Shading, you will find World Space Shading. If we enable that, now we can see our normal map is showing up correctly and we're still getting the correct sort of Fresnel. The problem with this is if we now hook in the color output of the main PBR shader, in fact, if we just select on the output node of the reflections are no longer working. So if we switch that off, reflections are working again. And the other aspect of it is if we come over to the Fresnel again, hook that up, if we try to render anything with this node, we're just going to get black. So things aren't really going to work properly with this Fresnel node. Or at least it's currently beyond me anyway. Something else that could be improved is that the hardness would be a lot simpler if it was exposed in the nodes. So in the way that I'm changing the hardness values down here to get the real-time highlights, instead of having all of these materials, we could just use one and then have this value here just sort of show up in maybe as a socket in here or something. That would probably make things a little bit easier. Otherwise, it's just a case of being hesitant to take this too far and really polish it like crazy, since there is the upcoming changes in the viewport and there are other options, which brings us nicely to cycles. So if we just switch to cycles and then Shift Z to see rendered mode, you see everything is nicely set up still. And this is because if we come over to the object tab, you can see there's our nodes for the Blender internal. And if we just sort of look a little bit further down, you can see there's this frame called cycles. Now this is from an artist called Malte Salas that I've basically copied from. And he was amazing enough to do a really good video that you'll see another link for around this video to really go through exactly how to emulate the Unreal Engine 4 shaders within cycles, and it's really pretty straightforward. I've just labeled up the nodes and what they're all doing in here and slightly simplified it. For example, there's no emission and things like that, but you can see that this is really straightforward. Just take the normal out without UVs to take it into the normal there. Otherwise, you can plug in the various textures where they need to go. But if we just take a look at the viewport, you can see it actually is fairly close to how it looks in Blender Render and cycles. And to do that, there's just a couple of things happening in cycles just to set this up. So first of all, what we're going to need is, if we just come over to the World tab of the node window, you can see that we've got these two environment textures. That's the rooftop night, and then there's the epic day. And also I've just rotated the position of the world just by -90 degrees on Z, just to align it up with how things are looking in Blender Render. The other subtle difference, if we come over to Blender Render and take a look at the lamp, we've got an energy of 1, but when we switch to cycles, you'll see that this is using nodes and it's a strength of 5 to kind of get something fairly reasonably similar. So what's cool about this setup is that you're going to get the Fresnel, you're going to get everything that you need for a proper PBR shader. It's just that you're not going to get it quite as real time as this kind of setup. So if we are able to do a whole bunch of work in here, and then I guess you could sort of check the precision of how things are looking if you try and emulate your same setup for the Cycles PBR group node below in the node editor. Now, another way to take this further is to use Malte's UE4 Cycles shader and take it into Clement Foucault's Real-Time Cycles experimental build, which you can get from here. Again, there'll be plenty of links with this video. So once that's downloaded, you can open it up and then open up the PBR Real-Time Internal shader, and you'll see at the bottom of all this, you'll get the Cycles stuff. So to set this up, we'll need to switch to Cycles, come over to Material View here, In the properties sidebar, we'll need to switch on our material preview here as well. Now we're not really getting much reflections yet, so if we come over to the World tab and open up this Viewport Probe area, we can enable both the auto refresh and to compute the diffuse. For the quality, if we watch for the reflections here, we want to increase this value to something around, say, 60 to 80 or so, and then we'll do that same thing for the diffuse. And that's it. Now what we can do is just split the view so that we can, in fact, let's close down these sidebars with N and T. Now in one of these views, let's go Shift Z to take a look in rendered view, and you can see it's pretty close. Now the reason it's not that close is if for some reason the only lamp which isn't that close is the sun in terms of its brightness. So if we just show something else instead, just put a point on there, you can see that that's far closer. In fact, let's just bring it a bit closer to it like this, and then maybe just increase the strength a little bit, so maybe something like 200, maybe 500 actually. You can kind of see that things are lining up pretty well, and that should work pretty well for the spotlight as well, as you can see. And there's a whole more bunch of options to refine the results that you can play with here. But what you've seen here is basically the essentials in getting set up. So again, a massive thanks to Clement Foucault for all the many hours he must have put into this. And also I believe he'll be involved in the Blender 2.8 Viewport project too. So it's all connected. So something else of interest is this new Armory 3D Blender game engine that's being worked on. This will also include a physically based rendering setup within Blender, and it's available as an add-on, and while there is a small fee to use it for the moment, that's there to basically help with development. Eventually it will be free for all. So thanks again to everybody. Thanks to Greg Zal for the environment maps, thanks to Multi-Sellers for the Unreal Engine 4 cycle shader. Thanks to the Blend for Web team, Clement Foucault, Mike Irwin, and many other Blender developers for continuing on with the real-time viewport. It's hugely appreciated, and apologies for any name mispronunciations that I must have littered through this video. So check out the links, and I'll see you next time.